In the year 1611, a group of translators read the original Hebrew of Genesis and made a historic decision. What they saw in that manuscript was so disturbing that they decided to hide it behind a single word. That word replaced a Hebrew term whose meaning completely transforms the entire account of the flood. And that deliberate substitution has shaped the faith of millions for exactly 400 years of history. The affected verse is Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, with 4 phrases altered in its English translation. When the original Hebrew terms are restored, Genesis ceases to be a vague and imprecise moral warning. It becomes a specific biological report on contamination of supernatural origin in very ancient times. To understand what was changed and why, we must start with the first of the 4 altered words in the text. The first substitution involves the word giants, used in the King James Bible since its initial publication. The original Hebrew does not say giants at any point in the text. It says Nephilim, with completely different roots and meanings. The Hebrew root of Nephilim is naphal, which means to fall, or in its causative form, to make others fall. The Nephilim were not simply tall men. They were the fallen, those who dragged humanity toward its end. The translators of 1611 were aware of that distinction. They had access to rabbinic texts and the complete Greek Septuagint. They did not make an involuntary translation error. They made a calculated decision to protect a convenient version. They chose giants because it is a folkloric concept that evokes popular tales and great enemies on battlefields. It does not evoke supernatural beings whose specific function was to make humanity fall from its original relationship with God. That is exactly what Nephilim means in the original Hebrew, and that is what the English translation concealed. 400 years of readers have passed by that verse, believing it described tall men, and not something more disturbing. The second altered sentence is also after that, 5 words that the translators kept without ever explaining. That phrase states that the Nephilim were on the earth before the biblical flood, and also after having endured it. Stop right there. The same text that describes the flood as a total purge says that the Nephilim managed to survive. Genesis 6, verse 7 says that God decided to destroy man, beast, reptile, and bird of the earth. But Genesis 6, verse 4, written by the same author, contains a clause that contradicts that total destruction. The Nephilim were before the flood, the text says, and also after, as if the water had not been able to reach them. That internal contradiction has no explanation within the Western biblical canon, as it arrived from the 4th century. It only makes sense when reading the text that the ecclesiastical institutions decided to exclude from the sacred canon. The Book of Enoch, chapters 6 and 7, describes the event with a precision that does not exist in any other ancient text. 200 celestial beings descended upon Mount Hermon and sealed a collective pact before executing their plan. They committed under a shared oath so that none could unilaterally retract at any time. They took human wives. The wives conceived the Nephilim. Their growth was recounted with horror in the ancient text. They consumed all the food that humans could produce, depleting the agricultural reserves of entire civilizations. When the food ran out, they began to devour human beings without distinction of age or condition. Then they devoured the animals. Then they devoured each other. They drank the blood of every living creature without exception. The earth, in the language of the Book of Enoch, cried out to heaven, asking for urgent and immediate divine intervention. The archangels presented that cry before the heavenly throne, and the response was the flood as an emergency measure. It was not sent because humanity was sinful in abstract terms or in its general moral behavior. It was a genetic quarantine because humanity had been biologically compromised by contamination from outside. That distinction between moral sin and genetic contamination is exactly what the 1611 translation removed from the text. The third altered phrase is children of God, which replaces the Hebrew Bene Elohim without explaining its true implication. The translation is technically possible, but theologically devastating in what it deliberately chooses not to say to the reader. Bene Elohim is exactly the same Hebrew phrase used in the Book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6, without ambiguity. In that passage from Job, the Bene Elohim are celestial beings who present themselves before God's throne in the divine council. The same expression appears in Job chapter 38, verse 7, where they joyfully acclaimed the creation of the world. In every use in the Old Testament, Bene Elohim designates beings of the divine council, not human descendants of any tribe. The translators of 1611 were aware of those parallels and translated the same expression differently in Genesis chapter 6. They did it to allow the Setite theory, an alternative reading that emerged in the 4th century without any prior textual precedent. That theory claims that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were simply the pious descendants of the patriarch Seth. The Setite theory does not exist in any Jewish or Christian source prior to the 4th century of the Common Era. It was specifically designed to neutralize the implications of the original Hebrew and thus protect the institutional reading. Julio Africanus was one of the first to articulate it, and his purpose was to eliminate the supernatural reading of the verse. Before the 4th century, Jewish writers and early church fathers read the text in a completely different way. Flavius Josephus described it as a literal angelic event. Philo of Alexandria did as well. Tertullian and Justin Martyr also. The Hebrew text states that beings from the divine council actively cross the barrier of species with human women. The English translation obscures that fact under a phrase that can be read as a generic and harmless moral category. The fourth altered phrase is renowned men, which replaces the Hebrew term Gibborim with an epic tone choice. Renowned men evoke heroes of antiquity, legendary figures deserving of admiration and collective memory. But Gibborim, read alongside Nephilim and Bene Elohim in its context, describes a hybrid progeny of very specific nature, beings that were neither fully angelic nor fully human, a biological category unprecedented in any other text. The Book of Enoch, chapter 7, describes the Gibborim with a specificity that allows for no romantic interpretation. They consumed everything that existed, the men, the animals, their own kind. They drank the blood of every living creature. It was neither a metaphor nor a narrative exaggeration. It was the literal record of what happened when the Gibborim exhausted the world. The Gibborim of Genesis were not epic heroes. They were a hybrid predatory species that nearly exterminated humanity. The translators chose renowned men because it sounded epic and transformed the verse into a legend of antiquity, not in a forensic report on biological contamination of external origin, which is exactly what the original Hebrew describes. Now read the verse with the original meanings fully restored, without any substitutions from 1611 of any kind. There were Nephilim, the fallen and those who caused the fall, on the earth before the flood, and also after having lived through it. When the Bene Elohim, beings of the divine council, joined with the daughters of men and begot hybrid children, they became Gibborim, predators of historical infamy, blood drinkers of the antediluvian era. That is what the Hebrew of Genesis 6 verse 4 really says, without embellishments or softening of any kind. That is what the translators of 1611 read in the manuscript before deciding which version would reach the ordinary reader. And the gap between what the Hebrew says and what the King James Bible conveys is where the Book of Enoch resides. That book has been preserved for more than 2,000 years by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church continuously and without interruption. While the Western Church sanitized Genesis 6, the Ethiopian preserved the complete account with all its details. The first Enoch, chapter 6, names the 200 angels by their names Semjaza, Azazel, Barakijal, and Kokabel. Chapter 7 describes the biological crossing between celestial beings and human women in precise detail. Chapter 8 details the technologies that the angels transferred to their human wives in that covenant. Metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, pharmacology, and writing. Knowledge that accelerated the corruption of civilizations. In chapter 10, the divine order to the Archangel Michael appears to bind Semjaza for 70 generations. And in chapter 15, the Ethiopian text describes what happened to the spirits of the Nephilim destroyed under the waters of the flood. Half of her nature was angelic, and the angelic essence does not dissolve or get destroyed by the action of physical water. Those spirits were released upon the earth when their physical bodies were destroyed and consumed by the waters. They are tied to the planet. They cannot ascend to the celestial plane. They cannot leave the environment of the human physical world. Hungry and formless vagabonds, seeking ways to interact with the descendants of the species that created them. That is what the original Hebrew of Genesis 6 implies, and what the King James translators removed from the text. The post-flood era is not a clean era. It is also an era inhabited by the spiritual residue of the Nephilim. And the Book of Enoch is the only ancient text that systematically maps the architecture of that coexistence in detail. Jude, chapter 1, verse 14, in the canonical New Testament, directly quotes 1st Enoch without ambiguity. Behold, the Lord comes with his saints to execute judgment upon all. Exact quote from chapter 1. Judas knew the Book of Enoch. He considered it scripture with enough authority to quote it in his pastoral letter. The early church accepted the letter of Jude as canonical, which creates a deeply significant structural contradiction. The biblical canon contains a quote from a book that the same canon was later edited to exclude from the collection. The contradiction is neither subtle nor secondary. It is structural, and it remains as evidence of the change between ecclesiastical eras. 2 Peter, chapter 2, verse 4, contains another reference that only makes sense with the Book of Enoch. If God did not spare the angels who sinned, but threw them into the abyss in chains of darkness for judgment. That phrase describes the binding of the watchers exactly as the first Enoch chapter 10 narrates it accurately. Pedro knew the framework of the Book of Enoch. Pedro affirmed it. The Bible contains the framework, but no longer preserves the source. Every Western reader of 2 Peter regarding angels bound in chains reads a reference to a book not included. Why was the Book of Enoch excluded from the Western canon if the apostles themselves used it as an active reference? The answer lies in the context of the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century under the already Christianized Roman Empire. That council systematized the canon under criteria that favored institutional stability over textual completeness. If the Book of Enoch remained in the canon, the framework of biological contamination was available to every reader. And if that framework became available, the explanation of the origin of evil would no longer require intermediaries to be understood. The translators of 1611 operated within that same institutional logic, also driven by the English crown. King James commissioned the translation to consolidate his religious authority in the kingdom without provoking theological conflicts. The team of translators was instructed to produce a unified Bible that would not generate any political controversy. Verse 4 of Genesis 6 was a controversy waiting to erupt due to its supernatural implications. They used the safest word available, giants, and 400 years of readers overlooked its true meaning. The Book of Giants, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, corroborates the Book of Enoch in great detail. That apocryphal text names specific Nephilim, records their dreams, and describes their fears as the flood approached. Reveal what their spirits do on earth after their physical bodies were destroyed by the floodwaters. The corruption that began in Genesis 6 did not end with the flood, as both the canonical text and the apocryphal writings affirm. The three texts converge on the same conclusion. It survived, transformed, operating from the spiritual plane over humanity. The first Enoch, chapter 93, records the apocalypse of the weeks, a prophetic line in 10 segments. The seventh week describes a generation in which forbidden knowledge will return to the world at an accelerated pace. The eighth week describes a final separation between the righteous and the corrupted, which the text calls inevitable and definitive. The ninth week describes the judgment that concludes the cycle initiated on Mount Hermon before Noah's flood. Tertullian and Irenaeus cited that passage as referring to events that would occur in the final generations of history. The categories of forbidden knowledge in the Book of Enoch, chapter 8, correspond to modern industrial sectors: metallurgy, pharmacology, cosmetics, astrology, and writing, all transferred by the watchers to their wives in the covenant. Whether that correspondence is accidental or intentional cannot be resolved at this point, but the textual fact remains firm. The Genesis describes an event of contamination. The Book of Enoch describes the same event with superior accuracy and detail. Both texts assert that this pollution did not end with the flood, and both point to a purification still pending. The phrase, "and also after that in Genesis 6 verse 4, is the most under-examined in the entire Western canon. It tells the reader that the Nephilim survived the flood. The Book of Enoch provides the specific mechanism of how. The angelic essence is not destroyed by water. It was released to the earthly plane when its physical bodies perished. Those spirits were confined between two worlds, without a body to inhabit the physical plane, without a pure origin to ascend to the celestial. They seek the descendants of the species that spawned them, for it is the only link they have left to material existence." The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, confirmed that fragments of the Book of Enoch were predating Christ. Those fragments from Qumran demonstrated that the text was circulating in Second Temple Judaism as a reference scripture. The community that copied them treated them with the same care as the Pentateuch, deliberately preserving multiple copies. This means that the Book of Enoch was not a marginal curiosity, but a central text for the Jewish communities of the time. The apostles grew up in that intellectual environment. They quoted the Book of Enoch because it was part of their religious education. The decision to exclude him was neither academic nor textual. It was a decision of power over access to religious knowledge. Without the Book of Enoch, the passages about unclean spirits in the New Testament lose the cosmology that supports them. The unclean spirits asked where to go, because the abyss meant confinement before the final judgment. With the Book of Enoch restored to the reading framework, each element of the New Testament fits into a coherent cosmology. The exclusion of the Book of Enoch not only concealed the origin of evil, but also removed the context of the proposed solution. And without that context, the Western understanding of evil was reduced to a moral category without the foundation that explains it. When you read giants in Genesis 6, you are reading the result of a 17th century editorial choice. A choice made in an English translation chamber to avoid controversy in the realm of King James I. The original Hebrew says something completely different. The translation does not convey it. Between the two lies 4 centuries of silence. The Book of Enoch was preserved in Ethiopia continuously, while the West crafted a sanitized version of the text. But Judas quoted it. Peter used it as a theological framework. The canon itself contains the reference to the book that was later excluded. That contradiction does not disappear over time. It becomes more evident as the pre-canonical manuscripts are studied. What the translators of 1611 read in Hebrew was a description of biological contamination of supernatural origin. A contamination that survived the flood in a different form, not physical, but equally active and present in the earth. What they decided the world would see was a poetic reference to men of great epic reputation in very ancient times. The distance between those two versions is where the most important question about the transmission of the biblical text lies. Why did institutions with access to the originals systematically choose the version that neutralized the supernatural? According to the framework of the Book of Enoch itself, control over the origin of evil is also control over human behavior. If you know that evil was imported through genetic contamination, you don't need intermediaries to understand it. Begin to cry out directly to the Creator to be sealed, as Revelation chapter 7 describes with utmost precision. That is the modern continuation of the same principle that motivated the flood to preserve a lineage untainted by mixing. The flood was literal. The preservation of Noah's lineage was literal. The promised sealing operates under the same logic. The elections of 1611 and the exclusions of the 4th century served the same institutional purpose throughout the ages, keeping ordinary readers unaware of the biological mechanism that, according to the texts, originated evil in the world. 400 years later, most Western readers pass through Genesis 6 without knowing what it really says. However, the texts are available. The pre-canonical manuscripts have been published and are verifiable by anyone. The gap between the original and the translation can no longer be completely hidden under the weight of ecclesiastical authority. What the Hebrew of Genesis 6 says is this: the fallen were present before the flood and also after having lived through it. That phrase survived the 1611 translation intact because removing it would have been too obvious for the scholars of the time. Without the Book of Enoch to contextualize it, that phrase remained suspended in the text without explanation or possible consequences. With the Book of Enoch restored to the reading framework, it becomes the most disturbing admission of the entire biblical canon. Noah was described in the Hebrew text as blameless in his generations, a phrase with implications of lineage. The Hebrew term is Tamim Bedrotav, which rabbinic commentators of the period interpreted as genetic purity. It was not said that Noah was the most righteous of his time, although that was also true according to the account in Genesis 6. It was said that he was blameless in his generations, which distinguishes his selection as a matter of unblemished lineage. If the flood was sent in response to a biological contamination, That genetic integrity explains why it was chosen. It was preserved not only for its piety, but because its lineage had not been mixed with that of the Nephilim or their descendants. That reading has direct consequences on how the re-emergence of the Nephilim after the biblical flood is understood. The text says that they reappeared after the flood because the pollution did not enter through the same route as before it. The spirits of the dead Nephilim sought new ways to influence the physical descendants of Noah and his family. They could not physically reproduce as before, but they could exert spiritual influence over the humanity that survived them. That is the architecture that the Book of Enoch describes in its chapters 15 and 16 with notable technical specificity. The spirits of the Nephilim are declared unclean and destined to wander the earth until the final judgment arrives. They have no place in heaven because their origin is hybrid. They have no place in the angelic realm because their body was human. They are trapped in the intermediate space between the human and the divine, seeking bodies that they cannot truly possess. That description, preserved in the Book of Enoch, is the context that gives meaning to numerous passages in the New Testament. When the Gospels describe exorcisms, the unclean spirits ask where to go if they are cast out of a human body. With the Book of Enoch as a framework, that question takes on a precise cosmological architecture that the canon only fragments. The spirits did not want to be sent to the abyss because the abyss meant being confined in advance to the final judgment. They preferred to enter the bodies of animals rather than be sent to the place of binding described in the first Enoch chapter 10. That context does not exist in the Western canon as it has been transmitted from the 4th century to the present in the West. Without the Book of Enoch, the exorcisms of the New Testament float in a theological vacuum without the cosmology that supports them. The exclusion of the text not only concealed the origin of evil, but also eliminated the architecture of the subsequent spiritual system. The institutions of the 4th century chose that reduction. The translators of 1611 consolidated it with their lexical choices. The result was a Genesis that serves as an uplifting legend rather than a technical report on the origin of evil. And that result persisted for 400 years because the control mechanism over the text was extraordinarily effective. The Nephilim survived. Their spirits roamed the earth. The text that explains it was excluded in the 4th century. Subscribe now so you don't miss the texts they excluded, because what comes next is even more disturbing.